Thank you very much, everybody, for inviting me and getting up so early in the morning as well. Look, I just wanted to talk a bit about what I've been involved in, and I will kind of relate it back eventually to the climate. I've been involved in Greenpeace for about 20 years, and for most of that time I've actually been a forest campaigner, and I still am a forest campaigner. The problem is as you get older, they want to give you more management responsibilities, but I've managed to deflect most of that onto my PA, so she runs Greenpeace and I continue my work as a forest campaigner. So, and I first got involved in forest, in protecting the world forests in about 1995, and I wanted to just relate a bit about that, because in a way, just in terms of explaining Greenpeace and also explaining the issue of climate change, it's important to understand a bit of our method and our madness. And we try to keep those two things in balance, but sometimes get that balance wrong. But I think it will give you just a little bit of an inkling in terms of how we work. In 1995, I went to Bowen Island, which is an island off the coast of Vancouver in the west coast, the Pacific side of Canada. And there'd been a long campaign to protect the temperate rainforest there. I mean, people normally understand rainforests as tropical rainforests like in the Amazon and so on, but there are also temperate rainforests. This was called the Great Bear Rainforest. It was a stunning place, full of brown bears, white spirit bears. There were phenomenal species of trees there that were 500, 1,000 years old, hundreds of feet high. I mean, they're not, in California you have redwoods, which are perhaps a bit more famous, but the temperate rainforests were a truly stunning and unique ecosystem. And what was extraordinary about it was that they were being destroyed at a phenomenal rate. I mean, we used to have temperate rainforests down the west coast of Scotland, for example, here, but you'll be lucky to find a few hectares left because they were destroyed centuries ago. But in the west coast of Canada, they were being clear-cut at such a massive rate that you could really see the horizon when these temperate rainforests were all going to go. And there was a huge fight in Canada with First Nations people, with environmentalists, with many people to try and protect them. But they were losing the battle against these huge corporations that were just literally mowing them down and basically turning them into pulp and paper, toilet paper, tissue paper, magazine paper, and they were losing the battle. And we had this discussion on Bowen Island about what could we do differently to protect these amazing rainforests. And we came up with the idea, of course it's not a particularly revolutionary idea now, but in those days, back in '95, we weren't doing so much of this type of campaigning, was actually to look at the market. Where were these products from this rainforest ending up? And so we decided to track it in terms of looking at where the paper was going, where it was ending up, who was using it. And what we needed to do as campaigning organizations, we needed to find a brand or something with a huge amount of profile where we could create an enormous stink to raise awareness about what was happening to rainforests to get these companies to change. Because you don't need to trash a rainforest to get your paper. You can recycle it or get it from plantations or whatever else. It's just cheap and convenient for them to do this. Anyway, we found that the BBC Wildlife magazine was being printed on this rainforest paper, which is slightly ironic. But it meant that Attenborough got involved in the campaign. And in Canada, that was quite important because they see the BBC as an arm of the government. And therefore, when Attenborough came out and condemned the destruction of the rainforest, they thought the British government was condemning the destruction of the rainforest. It had a big impact. The opposite happens when something similar goes on in India, but in Canada it was quite influential in terms of changing people's attitudes about what was happening there. And the other thing that we found, ironically, I mean, it's unbelievable where this stuff ends up, but it was actually also going in the skin of Linda McCartney's vegetarian sausages were coming from the cellulose from these rainforests as well. So of course the McCartneys got involved in this campaign. And the thing is that this was, in a way, really important, because then these big publishers that were publishing the BBC Wildlife magazine, but big German publishers, other people then got on board the campaign, and they started looking at their supply chain, looking at how their ingredients for their products were being produced. And it was the start of what was a journey really that was going to be quite a big transformation in the way multinational corporations around the world looked at this issue. And so we decided then that, okay, if it worked in Canada, could we now use it, for example, to protect the world's large, last intact rainforests, places like the Amazon, rainforest in the Congo Basin, the rainforest in Indonesia, and Sumatra, and Kalimantan, and so on. Because these rainforests were really critical. I mean, they're critical for the climate because they store vast amounts of carbon. They call trees carbon sticks. But they're also critical in terms of most of the world's biodiversity. Plants and animals are found in these rainforests. They're also, like you take the Amazon, about about a fifth of the world's fresh water is found in the Amazon. They're also important because if you take something like the Amazon, it's actually your rainfall patterns are dependent on the Amazon, because if you look at the global circulation models, the rain goes around the Amazon, Brazil, crosses the Atlantic, around Africa, around Europe, across the Caribbean. These are part of huge global circulation models that you find spinning around the world. You destroy the Amazon and you disrupt rainfall patterns, and they're already seeing this in Brazil now. Like Sao Paulo and Rio are suffering horrendous droughts. And city of Sao Paulo, 20 million people, if it runs out of water, what do? You cannot live, I don't know how long you can live for, 24, 48 hours without liquid. So, your life depends on it. So these things are kind of important. So when we looked at the Amazon, we sort of thought, what is driving the destruction of the Amazon? And we found that there were two big drivers. One of them was soya. And basically, it's just a bean, and it gets fed to pigs and chickens, mainly in Europe and in China. So here you have one of the world's treasures, of enormous importance globally to all of us, was just being destroyed to feed pigs and chickens. Now, of course, that also begs the question about our economic model, because you can have probably one of the world's greatest treasures, the Amazon rainforest, but in the way we kind of view the world and our economic system, it has no value. It only has a value when you destroy it and plant soya, so you can get a bean that you can sell to feed a pig or a chicken. Then it has value. And that's something that I think we kind of need to think about in terms of, like, what does value mean? How do we view value? How do we realize value? How do we even compensate maybe a country that has something like the Amazon that globally we need to protect, but it doesn't have any value, it doesn't earn them money unless they destroy it. So I think that's one of the big issues that we kind of need to think about. But when we looked at soya, what we found was that there were thousands of farmers. A lot of them were kind of coming in from the south that were just destroying the rainforest, planting soya, massive monocultures, employing very few people. I mean, these are estates, some of them tens of thousands of hectares in size. And we couldn't go to the farmers and say, please don't cut down the rainforest, because they would just shoot us. But what we did find is that there were only 3 or 4 companies that were giving those farmers capital to develop those farms and were buying those soya beans. 3 of them were American. It was Cargill, ADM and Bunge, one Brazilian Blairomagi and a French company called Dreyfus. Now Cargill is an interesting company because it's a private American company. It's not well known, but on their website they say any plate of food anywhere in the world, 1 in 3 of the ingredients will have passed through that company. That's how big and how powerful they are. They are massive traders of every single agricultural commodity that is produced on this planet. The problem for us as campaigners was that if we wanted to go to Cargill or ADM or Bunge, and these people are, they're not exactly progressive people, they're big funders of Bush and the Republican Party and so on, was that we had no traction with them. And so we had to find a way that gave us some kind of influence. And so we decided, we have an office in Brazil and in the Amazon, and we decided to track that soybean, like from the farm through to the storage terminals on the Amazon River, then tracking it out into the ports in Europe, so it came to Liverpool, for example, to a processing plant, and then from that processing plant to the factories or the farms where it was being, or the factory farms, where it was being fed to chickens, and then where those chickens were then ending up. Now, that's phenomenally difficult to do. It took us, I can't remember, maybe 2 years to do that. Because even at the Liverpool end, when we were looking at the soya coming out of the processing plant, we had to follow every lorry. And those lorries were just going to places that weren't of interest to us because we had to find an iconic brand. But eventually, we followed a lorry that went to a Cargill chicken farm in Herefordshire. And that was absolutely key for us because then we found out who they were supplying. And eventually, we managed to follow a lorry that was going from that Cargill plant in Herefordshire to a McDonald's plant where it was being turned into chicken McNuggets to be fed to people on the high street. Now McDonald's was the brand that we wanted because we needed a brand that was big and that was powerful, that could actually, if we could win them over to our side, would actually go back down the chain and force those big multinational corporations to the table. Now we ran a campaign against McDonald's. It lasted about 24 hours before they phoned up and asked to speak, which is what we were expecting, and we were glad they did. But McDonald's became, ironically in a way for Greenpeace, people did question why we're getting into bed with McDonald's. We weren't really getting into bed with them, but they did become our most powerful ally and partner because McDonald's happened to be the biggest partner of Cargill's. They were really important customers. If McDonald's told Cargill to do something, Cargill could not ignore them. And McDonald's, to their credit, became really tough campaigners. They forced Cargill to do a number of things, including, for example, sign anti-slavery agreements. I mean, there were lots of big social as well as environmental issues. But eventually they did get Cargill to agree not to finance farmers that were involved in destroying the Amazon. And Cargill in turn got an agreement with ADM and Bunge and with Blairomagi in Brazil that all of them collectively would agree that they would not buy soya from farmers involved in deforesting the Amazon. Now, just a few weeks ago, all of those corporations signed, and their trade body, signed an agreement for the 8th year, because this happened 8 years ago, for the 8th year that this moratorium would continue until April 2016. And they've re-signed this moratorium every year. And as a result of that, although there is some deforestation happening in the Amazon, I don't deny that, and there are reasons for it, that these companies have held to that agreement, and hardly any deforestation happens in the Amazon as a result of soya. And the rates of destruction in the Amazon have also dropped dramatically. I mean, unbelievably, if you go back about 10, 15 years, there was about 27,000 square kilometers of the Amazon was destroyed every year. An unbelievable amount. Today, it's about 4,500 square kilometres. It is still huge, but the drop has been dramatic. And there was a very similar campaign that we ran on cattle, and again it was the same. There was just 3 companies that were buying the beef and leather products at the end of the day from the thousands of farmers that were involved in deforestation in the Amazon for cattle. We ran the same kind of campaign. Now, when it came to Indonesia, it was slightly different because there it was for palm oil and pulp and paper. Now, with palm oil, you will find it in almost everything that you use. All your food products, toothpaste, anything you pick up and you use, you will find palm oil in it. And it was by far and away the largest driver of deforestation that was happening in Indonesia, in the rainforest belts across Sumatra and Kalimantan. And the largest buyer of palm oil in the world is Unilever, which has their headquarters just over the river down there. And as you know, Unilever have some of the world's most famous brands, and they own lots of other companies like Ben & Jerry's and so on. And we traced the palm oil that was going into Unilever's brands from companies in Indonesia that were involved in large-scale deforestation. And we did this, I don't know, some of you might remember this campaign, but we did a spoof of a Dove advert where Dove is a very famous brand of Unilever's, and they'd use these different shapes and sizes of women on a very famous advert. And we changed it and used orangutans of every shape and size, but reproduced their advert and made a very powerful viral film about the impact and effect of what they were doing in terms of where they were sourcing their palm oil. And it was quite interesting because at that time, this was in 2008, the vice president of Unilever was interviewed on Sky News, and the interviewer asked him, "Do you know where your palm oil comes from?" And he said, "I'm afraid to say that for most of it, I don't know." And it was an extraordinary statement for Unilever to make. They would never make such a statement today because now they know where everything comes from. But in those days, not so long ago, 5 years ago, they didn't know. And what was also more extraordinary, that after this campaign, and they agreed to work with us on this issue, they actually wrote to their suppliers asking to come and visit the palm oil plantations. 5 of their suppliers refused them permission to visit. Now, Unilever, to their credit, immediately cancelled all the contracts with those companies. But the thing is, they'd never asked, and they'd never visited. And that was what was kind of shocking, because they didn't know where the ingredients from their products were coming from. And this was, I know now that on other social issues, people are concerned about slavery, about child labour, about working conditions in factories, and so on and so forth. But there were also all of these other issues about the environmental destruction, as well as the social impacts that were going on, that these companies knew nothing about. They hadn't bothered to check, despite all of their propaganda, all of the fine words they talk about, and so on and so forth. They knew very little about what was going on. But to Unilever's credit, and particularly when Paul Polman, the new CEO, took over, they did change, and they went on a journey for, really supported many initiatives around sustainability. And we ran a similar campaign against Nestle, because while Unilever agreed to take products that were involved in deforestation out of their supply chain, Nestle at the same time refused to budge. And some of you might remember there was a viral film we made. Unilever made these adverts of people doing really quite boring, monotonous jobs, like at a supermarket checkout or something, and then they kind of nod off to sleep, and then they'd eat a Kit Kat. And they have a break, have a Kit Kat, and they were quite well known ads, and we reproduced one of those ads, and it was basically when the guy broke the Kit Kat, there was an orangutan finger in it, and blood spewed everywhere and made a mess. Anyway, it was viewed by millions of people, and millions of people took action off the back of it, and and Nestle made a big mistake, because they started attacking us on social media. They started banning. They tried to get YouTube to ban the ad. They did a whole load of mistakes, really crude mistakes, which meant far more people got interested in the campaign, not because they were interested in the environmental issue, but because they were interested in freedom of speech and the right to be able to see things and so on and so forth. So it kind of massively backfired on them. And we then went to their AGM in Geneva, and that we did an action there when basically we'd hidden the roof of where their AGM was going to be held for 3 days, because they knew we were coming and there was massive security, but they'd managed to get inside the roof of where the AGM was. And when the CEO got up to speak, we just showered the entire auditorium with leaflets about what Nestle was doing. The CEO was really pissed off. But the thing is that it was, in the end, after that AGM, we did have a meeting with them, and they decided that they were going to change, that they were also going to take deforestation out of their supply chain. And actually, to Nestle's credit, they have over 2 million suppliers of their ingredients down to farm level, and they have now mapped their entire supply chain in an unbelievable exercise to find out where all their products are coming from, the conditions under which they're being produced, and to try and drive sustainability through their supply chain. There were many other companies that we ran similar campaigns against on the palm oil issue, until we eventually got the palm oil industry in Indonesia and the big players in Singapore and Malaysia. In fact, one of the big palm oil players owns Battersea Power Station. They're involved in lots of other things. But we got them to change to the extent now that every palm oil producer has now agreed that they will not be involved in deforestation, that there will be a moratorium on further clearance of rainforest for palm oil. And these are global policies, so they can't like move to West Africa and start doing the same thing. These are things that they've agreed to do globally. This is it's an incredible shift from where we were. And the last big industry was the pulp and paper industry, and there were two players in Indonesia. One of them was Asia Pulp and Paper, APP, and the other is called APP. And we ran basically, there'd been a campaign against APP for a long time by just about every environmental organization on the planet. They were probably, in terms of one company, the largest destroyer of rainforests. They destroyed, well, they probably destroyed maybe 1 million, maybe 2 million hectares of rainforest in Sumatra. It was massive, unbelievable levels of destruction. And they were also draining the peatlands. And the peatlands store vast amounts of carbon. And basically they were digging canals, draining the water out, and putting acacia trees into these peatlands to grow the plantations for pulp and paper. And people had tried to negotiate with them. WWF, every organisation had tried to and failed. And so we decided we would run a similar campaign to get all of their customers to break contracts until they agreed to stop deforestation. And again, it was a lot of household names were involved in this. And one of the most famous campaigns that we ran was against Mattel, that own Barbie. It's a big toy company, but they have a massive amount of packaging, and they were a very big customer of APP. And we made another viral film. Basically, I think Mattel had got Ken and Barbie back together again on Valentine's Day or something. And basically, we made a very powerful viral film where Ken dumped Barbie because she was involved in so much rainforest destruction. And it was a slightly camp film. It was quite emotional. My wife complained about it because she said Barbie couldn't give a damn what Ken did. He was just a toy and could be disposed of. So the idea that she would be upset by Ken dumping him, it was far too academic and intellectual. But basically it was very effective, because the thing about these viral films is that they're watched by millions of people, and millions of people take action as a result of them. And so it was very powerful. In the end, we got about 140 corporations around the world to cancel their contracts with Asia Pulp and Paper. It was massive. And the last you know, and they were fighting back. They were putting these stupid adverts on Sky TV. You might have noticed, and it was Sir Martin Sorrell's company, who you know, the owner of WPP, who were the kind of PR and an ad agency for APP. They were the sort of the greenwash. Does anybody work for them? Anybody work for any of their companies? They own everything in the advertising world. But I went to see Sir Martin Sorrell several times, and in the last meeting I had with him, he said, John, why don't you and I go to Sir Martin and see what's happening for ourselves? So I said, okay. I didn't think he was serious about this, but anyway, I got back to the office and there was an email from him saying, what date are we going? So anyway, we agreed. We agreed about a month later. So I got a business visa to go to Indonesia. I mean, I go back and forward there occasionally, but anyway, I got a business visa, as did he. And he only told his client that he was coming. Nobody else knew. And so we went there. I mean, I went there, you know, on some cheap light aircraft. He probably went on his private jet. But anyway, we were going to meet in Jakarta on a certain date. And I landed at Jakarta airport. I was picked up by security and deported out of the country. And he got in. Now, the only people who knew that I was coming, because I had a visa and everything else, was APP. So what was quite extraordinary, that APP had managed to get the security services to have me kicked out of the country because they knew I was going there with Sir Martin Sorrell. Anyway, he continued with his visit, but he was also harassed a lot. And we took him to Sumatra, we showed him what was going on. It was kind of quite bizarre, because he was also a friend of the president of Indonesia, so it was funny the way they were playing with us like this. But anyway, he saw what was going on, we came back, he didn't cancel the contract. But after I was deported, a few weeks later, Asia Pulp and Paper phoned up and asked for a meeting. And I went with an Indonesian colleague to Singapore this time, and met the company, the owners of the company, the Wijaya family in Singapore, and they agreed to negotiate. And we negotiated with them for about a year, and then there was a big event in Jakarta the following year. There was about 300 people there, lots of ambassadors, lots of other people there, and they agreed to turn off the bulldozers to stop the clearance of the continuing clearance of the rainforest in Indonesia. And they agreed to a massive restoration program, about 1 million hectares, particularly of peatlands. They've agreed over time that they will restore, and we're working on them in that restoration program. So this was a huge change, but 1 minute, 2 minutes, 1 minute, but it only came about because of the pressure, you know, from campaigners, from corporations that brought me to the table. And the other company, April, you may have seen last week, Santander cancelled all the loans and contracts with them, and we will also negotiate an agreement with them to stop the rainforest clearance. The reason why all of this is important, not just in terms of the biodiversity, in terms of our rainfall patterns, in terms of the people who are dependent on those forests, in terms of the animals and everything else that exists there, but it's also really important for the climate, because when we talk about climate, we often talk about fossil fuels, renewable energy, energy efficiency, and so on and so forth, which is one aspect of it. But of course, we make our lives 1,000 times more difficult if we don't actually look at what is already happening in the natural world, how protecting the natural world also protects us, and that we are part of the natural world. We destroy it, we destroy ourselves. So actually protecting the forest is one of the best things that we can do, and that's why, you know, I've been quite passionate about it, and why, you know, I've been fortunate enough to be able to work in this area for, you know, the last several decades. But I think we also wouldn't have been as successful as we have been without the involvement of the creative industries in London, because all of the work that we've done in terms of the films that we produced, the adverts, the campaigns and so on have been put together. We've used some of the best creative brains in London. And interestingly, I'm not going to name names, but there were lots of people involved in our campaign because it was inevitable, that were also involved in brands and companies that were involved in destroying the rainforest, but in their own time, spare time, at weekends, and through their contacts and various other things, they helped us enormously, and they achieved a huge amount. And as a result, we've engaged millions of people, and millions of people have taken action. And I could witter on for hours, but that's not better ask me.
Okay, I'm afraid I'll have to stop it here and open it for questions. But thank you so much, Ron.
Okay,
What we're going to do now is just take a couple of questions. No, okay, go ahead.
First of all, I'm from Vancouver, so I know Bowen Island quite well, so thank you for saving that part of the world. And I guess my question is pretty general. As consumers, what do you think the top 3 things are that we can do that help the environment and rainforests?
Yeah, I mean, look, the thing about, I mean, look, we could discuss consumption as well in terms of like, what do we do about the whole problem of consumption, because it is a big issue, and I think that, you know, from my point of view in terms of like the forests, is that if you look at land, you know, about 70% of land is used either for grazing animals or feeding animals, and it's not, and then another chunk of land is used to produce fuel for our cars. Very small amount of land is actually used to feed us. So it's a kind of, if there is an issue around land use, and how do we feed 7 going on 9 billion people? How do we solve the problem of, like, you know, 850 million people going to bed hungry every night, maybe another 2-3 billion people having hidden hunger? We've got to kind of come to a conclusion about how we're going to use that land. So my feeling about being a consumer is that the one thing that would make a huge amount of difference, and if we could ever find a way of being able to communicate this or come up with a campaign around this, and I'd be very interested in discussing this if anybody wants to discuss it, because I'd love to do this, would be how we could change people's consumption of meat. And I don't think we could run a no meat campaign, because it wouldn't work, but I would love to think about how we might be able to label meat with like we do with cigarettes, with a kind of health warning, because it also creates, you know, type 2 diabetes, it creates cancer, it has all kinds of health impacts. Processed meat has even more health impacts, so the health industry are also up in arms about it. So, you know, in terms of health and environment, how we deal with meat and what kind of meat we eat is really critical. I think if there was one thing that we could do that would have an enormous impact, it would be to solve that problem.
One more question, quite quickly, and then we'll move to the other area. Go ahead.
Can you pass the mic to...
Yes, sorry, otherwise not.
Hi, thank you for that talk. It's really insightful. I just wondered, because you mentioned you're interested in working with creative people. So how does that work with Greenpeace and working with creative people? What's the process?
Well, I mean, the thing is, I mean, we try to make our campaigns as creative and as innovative as we can, and some of that is developed internally within the organisation, but a lot of it is developed working in partnership with others, and some of that work is done pro bono. I mean, there's some creative people out there that we have long-standing relationships with who lend their time. Sometimes if they own agencies, they give us some of their staff time. Sometimes that's good for creative agencies, because actually if you're just involved in, you know, your life's, you know, selling an ice cream or a shampoo or something, sometimes it's quite good for staff to be involved in a different kind of projects that has benefits for them as well. But sometimes, well, you know, a lot of the time we're paying for creative work. So, you know, we're working with agencies, but we're paying them for their time, so we just have a normal commercial relationship. The fun thing about working with Greenpeace is that we don't care that much about, you know, there are no limits. So, you know, when you're working with a corporation, or even if you're working with a charity, they're operating within fairly confined rules and regulations. Whereas with Greenpeace, the more rules and regulations we can break, the better. So it allows people to have more kind of creative possibilities.
And I'm sorry, Miss Hands up. Thank you so much. It's been amazing having you.